like what I have done in the past is prior to, I was in Good Spirit School Division a few years ago, and there what they did when outcome-based assessment was gaining momentum was they worked with Christ the Teacher, which is a Catholic school division, and so they brought groups of teachers together and they co-constructed rubrics. And so what they did was, essentially, if you look at those rubrics, the outcome is on the left-hand side, and then the indicators are on the right. But the indicators of achievement are indicators from the curriculum. So when they brought these groups of teachers together, basically what they did was they went through these indicators and they said, you know, what indicators do we best feel demonstrate understanding of this outcome? And so they did that work. And so basically then, if the students have access to the rubric, which they should, then they can kind of see where they're landing in that rubric and where the target is, right? So then they have that awareness of where they're at and where they need to get to. Does that make sense? I guess it kind of goes back to that first question about self-assessment too. Like, if they can kind of see where the target is, and then they can see, you know, where they're landing, then they understand where their own growth is. I started working on some self-assessment tools for math where basically I took those indicators and I was putting them in around a circle, right? And they had to rate themselves to see if their understanding of the outcome was balanced. But that was a ton of work in terms of formatting, and I never did get those quite done. But that's kind of where the next place I was going in terms of in terms of differentiated assessment and self-assessment. That's where I wanted to go next, because I find kids' self-assessment is really on point, and it's they usually know exactly what they know and what they don't know. Yeah, and when you ask kids about the first thing, the first question, like if you're asking them to self-assess and they tell you like, you can just ask kids very informally, like on a scale from 1 to 10, where are you, or 1 to 5? And if they tell you they're at a 7, then you respond by saying, okay, what do you need? Do you need reteaching? Do you need more practice? Do you need, and then you have to give them options about what it is they need, because otherwise the assessment, you're not responding to that assessment. So then it kind of begs the question about why are you doing it? Because if you're not responding to the assessment, then it really, you should be questioning why you're doing it. Lots of just simple things you can do, like you can like there's lots of times, like I've self-reflection, like what are you doing in well, and then what's an area you need to work on. This year I had my grade 8s do we called it the zones. And so what are you feeling comfortable with, what's stretching you with this outcome, and what's panic. And so even little things like that, just giving them a structure to self-assess is basically what you need. The more you use the same structure, the better it is, because then they're not learning about the structure and they can think more about their self-assessment, right? Whereas if I'm constantly switching the structure that I'm using to self-assess, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Because then I'm not allowing that depth of thinking, because they're becoming more familiar with each structure, and I don't want that. I just want a few. I haven't done a lot of work with English language learners, but if you were to do it in math, you would be doing it with lots of manipulatives and lots of observation is how you would do it. So when you look at the rubrics, there are parts of the rubrics where it talks about explaining. That wouldn't be as it's really tricky because you wouldn't be able as well to assess what's called conceptual understanding in math. But if you kind of overloaded or compensated with your observations with the manipulatives, then you would probably be able to get enough information about whether they had conceptual understanding. So that's what you would do in math. You would be pulling out manipulatives and stuff like that, and lots of pictures. Lots of teachers think that you just do that in like primary grades, but you do that all the way up. The more visual you make the math, the easier it is for the kids to learn it because you're creating more access points. But then once again, it goes back to assessing their conceptual understanding and if they truly understand what you're teaching them. So it would be through pictures, manipulatives, like observing with the manipulatives and things of that nature. That's what I would do with English language learners, because I've been asked that in the past, but I don't have a lot of experience with that. Really cool too, like there's an Indigenous language, this is just a sidebar, where like so like in English, we compare numbers. So 4 is 3 less than 7, right? They can subtract, they can take away, but in some languages, there's no words for less than, like 3 less than 7 or 4 less than 7 or whatever, because they don't believe that it's appropriate to compare like that, because they think it makes one person feel badly, which I think is really cool. So you get to talk about some, things that are math, but not necessarily math in math class when you do stuff like that. Generally speaking, there's like observations and conversations. So you're triangulating your data. Your conversations and your observations are far more richer. Like they're such rich sources of data that you almost don't need, I don't want to say you don't need pen and paper, but the pen and paper is almost secondary. In terms of like what you need for pen and paper, you only need kids to demonstrate a concept. So let's say double digit addition. They only need to get 4 questions right. That's basically what Steve Lywan says, because after that, your data gets saturated. So 4 allows you to see consistency. And then after that, your data is saturated and you're kind of wasting your time. So, but you'll often see in math that teachers just overload pen and paper, and they'll have a quiz that has 20 of the same questions, which is unnecessary. So in math too, and like I've thrown out this phrase before, like earlier, there's what's called procedural fluency, and then there's what's called conceptual understanding. And so pen and paper tasks, they're really looking at procedural fluency. So procedural fluency is just like, are they following the steps or the algorithm or the formula, right? Whereas I want to know about their conceptual understanding. So when they're adding 2-digit numbers, and let's say in the ones column, there's a 7 and a 6, and they put a 1 up here, do they understand that that 1 represents 110? And can they tell me that? And that's what I really want to know. And I don't get that information unless I talk to the kids, right? And so observations and conversations give you richer data than just your pen and paper tasks. So is that kind of what you were looking for there? I do a ton of assessment through observation and conversation. I took all of those rubrics that I referred to earlier, that Good Spirit and Christ the Teacher developed. I took all of them and I turned them into tools to document observations and conversations. And then when the kids are at my desk in small group, I would just track what I'm seeing them do. And then if I were missing something in my data or in my assessment, then I might use some pen and paper tasks. But the more I can do by observation and conversation, the better the understanding I have of where the kids are in terms of their learning and how to move them forward. And then when I see them do something, like, you don't want to take anecdotal notes because that takes way too much time. And if I'm spending all that time writing those notes, I'm not responding to those kids and to their learning. And if I don't respond in the moment, I'm not pushing that learning forward, right? And so then the opportunity to really push those kids and get them to grow is lost. So I want to be able to check off what I'm seeing very quickly and document it very quickly, but I also need to be able to respond in order to move them to where I want to get them. So yeah, just watch them. Watching them is super important too. The other reason that's important is because kids don't need a lot of feedback to move their learning forward, but they need feedback that's specific to them. So if I just give general feedback to the class, what happens is I might be giving them feedback about an entire question or, many steps, and then they have to process that and filter that through and think, well, what do I need from what she's saying and what don't I need? Whereas if I give them feedback that's very specific to them, that filtering process doesn't happen. And then the focus is just on figuring out how to apply the feedback, right? And so, like I said earlier, they don't need a lot of feedback. You don't want to give them too much because you'll overwhelm them, but they need feedback that is specific to them and their learning. And the only way I can do that is by observing where they're at. And so sometimes my observations are summative assessment where I'm seeing exactly what I want to see and I don't have any concerns and I can move them, into exceeding or exemplary. And sometimes I need to respond and just do something to get them to grade level, nudge their learning. So it's kind of like a volleyball game. The ball goes back and forth, back and forth. That's what you want to happen in truly responsive and authentic assessment. Kind of like what I was talking about before, you know what you're looking for in those conversations because the curriculum is telling you what to look for, and you know what to look for in your observations because the curriculum has told you in those indicators is it's very specific about what it's looking for. And then you go and you look for those things and you try and you document. Like I said, it's easier to document with checklists than anecdotal notes. And then you put it all together and you look and you see, does the student have the complete picture to demonstrate understanding of this outcome? So it's kind of, yeah, but you look at those rubrics and some of them are more, some indicators are a better fit for a pen and paper task, some are a better fit for a conversation, and some are a better fit for an observation. So you figure out what the best form of assessment is, and then you try to, and there's balance there, right? Like you don't want to be too heavy on one, but lots of times you need a little bit of everything, right? But the more you talk to them, the deeper the understanding you have of where their learning is at. Even in terms of like how they learn, like whether they're really visual or if they're more symbolic or abstract. And once you kind of come to understand who they are as learners, then you really have a lot of power to make a difference as a teacher when you kind of understand how they think and learn. You'll notice in kids is some kids will be able to accept feedback, so that means they don't shut down. Some kids won't. So that's kind of the first step. And then the second step is, can they apply the feedback? And lots of kids really struggle with how to apply feedback, and you really have to watch and kind of guide them through that process. We used to do, with a group that I had prior, we used to create what we would call arguments, and they would have to prove something like with pictures, numbers, and words. So they had to have 3 kind of forms of explaining how to do something. And so they were in pairs. They did this. We did a gallery walk, and they had to give feedback to one another. So I think they had to do 2 stars and a wish. So they had to give 2 compliments, and then, you know, they had to have a question about something. And what I found really fascinating was the feedback that I had given the kids in the first round, like the feedback that the kids gave to one another was the exact same feedback that I would have given as the teacher. And so the kids got the feedback and they had to do another draft of their argument, but not a lot of them could apply the feedback. And that was really eye-opening for me to see that as the teacher, like, okay, it doesn't really matter. I don't want to say it doesn't matter who the feedback is coming from, because it's less intimidating coming from their peers rather than me. But the ability to apply that is really, really hard for kids, and they need a lot of scaffolding and support there. Like, I guess that's your role as the teacher, is to guide that and support them in that. Anything that I think might be formative can become summative, and anything that I thought might be summative could become formative depending on what I'm seeing on that piece of paper or in that conversation or whatever. So I don't feel like I'm bound that way.